Sarah and Abraham had a nice 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath house in the suburbs. It had a 2-car attached garage into which their Toyota Camry and Toyota Corolla fit well. Their house had all the amenities that they needed. They had a meticulously manicured lawn. They also had good retirement plans. They had good neighbors with whom they enjoyed summer barbecues, playing cards, and going to the theater. They liked to travel, but each time they returned, they recited the words of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, "There is no place like home, there is no place like home." They had already purchased their cemetery plots because they were certain that they would spend the rest of their lives right where they were, settled and secure. Sarah and Abraham regularly attended worship. They had served in various capacities. They had chaired nearly every board. Sarah had been moderator, and Abraham and Sarah each sometimes preached when their minister was on vacation. They gave 1/10 of their income to the church and contributed to every special offering. They were the kind of members that every one of us would want on the roll at Central. Sarah and Abraham would agree with me. They were content and they were happy. But then there was this voice within them that they were certain was the voice of God, telling them to leave their home and all the comfort that it included. God told them that there was a land of promise that would be given to them. And in spite of their advanced years, God told them that they would have children, even though, as I've heard it said, Sarah would have to give birth in the geriatric ward. At first, Sarah laughed until the tears rolled down her weather-worn face. She laughed at the prospect of having children in her old age. She thought that it had to be a huge joke that God was playing on her. To use other words, she thought that God was trying to punk her. God must have understood her reaction because God joined in the laughter by telling Sarah and Abraham that their first child was to be named Isaac, which means, you guessed it, laughter. Sarah and Abraham wrestled and wrestled with whether to leave home. But in the end, they were convinced that God had called them, and they knew that in all their years of marriage, things had always worked out for the best when they had followed God's call. As hard as it was, they felt it was the right thing and best thing to do. In some ways, it felt as if it were the only thing to do. Behind Sarah's and Abraham's back, their neighbors thought they were crazy and talked about it, but in front of them, they gave them their blessing. So off they went with their SUV packed with all the belongings that they could shove into it. Our reading today states it simply. So Abraham went as God had told him. To be more inclusive than the Bible is, we could say Abraham and Sarah went as God told them. Eventually, they made it to the land that they had been promised. And did you notice the first thing that happened? I said it in the story for all ages. There was a famine. A famine in the promised land. What a contradiction. God had promised that they would thrive, and a famine came to the promised land. This is a reminder that faith does not always make everything hunky-dory. Regardless of the depth of our commitment to God, good and bad both happen to us. The question is whether we are going to continue to trust God. Sarah and Abraham did most of the time. For sure, they had their moments when they wondered what they had gotten themselves into. Still, the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament cites them as supreme examples of faith. To give our lives over to God means that we cast our lives into God's loving arms, trusting that God is with us no matter what, and that God is directing us. For a variety of reasons, I've been thinking about trust lately. It seems that at every turn, the devotional readings that I picked up have been about trust. I suppose it's something I've needed to hear. You know how that is. We all have certain themes that arise in our lives that stick with us for a while at opportune times. Then they might go away for a while and are replaced by other themes. Trust, as I said, has been the theme for me as of late. A story by a minister who was also a novelist speaks to the matter of trust. His daughter suffered from the eating disorder anorexia. He was at a loss as to what to do. No amount of encouraging her to eat had any results. One day he was driving home. A car passed him. He noticed the license plate. It simply said, "Trust." It was as if God were speaking to him. He had an overwhelming sense of peace. A light came on for him. He realized that by trying to control his daughter, he was actually making things worse. At that particular point, his daughter was on the west coast of the United States and he was on the east coast. And as it turned out, that was the best thing for both of them. By being that distance from each other, he couldn't try to control her as he had, which he couldn't do anyway, whether she was close or far from him. As a bit of an aside, the person who was driving the car with the words "trust" on the license plate read the story of this minister writer, the story that he composed about that experience with the car passing him that day. And the driver of the car tracked him down and handed the license plate to him. The man turned out to be a trust officer in a bank. But he was touched by the story. Who knows? Maybe it is more than a mere coincidence. I don't know. But I do know that where there is room for faith, there is also room for doubt. For reasons that we may consider crazy, Sarah and Abraham trusted. The way truly to live is with trust, because the truth of the matter is that we simply don't know what life will bring us. We can make plans, as we should, but the best laid plans often don't work out the way that we think they will. Anne Lamott says something that I have heard others say. She says that if you want to make God laugh, tell God your plans. Sarah and Abraham did not have scientifically verifiable evidence that God was calling them to leave home, but in that part of them where deep truth resides, they heard God's voice calling and they chose to follow the call. I've heard it said, perhaps you have too, that we shouldn't believe anything we've heard and half of what we've seen. I suppose sometimes seeing is believing, but it's also true that believing is seeing. Once we believe, it opens our heart to the truth. 17th century French mathematician, physicist, inventor, philosopher, and Catholic writer Blaise Pascal said, "The heart has its reasons which reason does not know." He goes on to say that we feel 1,000 things. It is the heart which feels God and not reason. This then is perfect faith. God felt in the heart. And he goes on to say, we know the truth not only by reason, but also by the heart. The Epistle to the Hebrews says that faith is the conviction of things not seen. We could add to this that faith is trust in seeing with the heart. Trust is important, not just for individuals, but for communities of faith like ours as we trust our present and future to God. This does not mean that we are passive. Trust is as much a verb as it is a noun. To trust does mean to let go and let God, to use an adage that many in AA try to live by. But trust is an action verb. When we trust, we live out our faith commitment. There's a rhythm to trusting. We let go, and then we pick up and move on. We let go, and then we pick up and move on. That's the way it was for Sarah and Abraham. Genesis tells us that Sarah and Abraham would travel for a while, then they would pitch their tent and rest. They even left the promised land for a while when the famine came. They traveled to Egypt and lived in a tent along the way. They did not build a house and settle permanently. There's a sense in which those who follow God's voice are never settled. We are always in the process of becoming more of what God wants us to be and calls us to be. Maya Angelou tells the story about someone who asked her one time, "Are you a Christian?" In her wise way, she responded, "You mean already?" You get that? We never fully arrive. It's an ongoing journey in which we live in tents so we can pick up and move to where God calls us. It can be a tough journey. To be a follower of Jesus isn't always an easy road. As a matter of fact, it's anything but an easy road. Jesus said that to be his disciple, we had to deny ourselves, take up a cross, and follow him. Jesus said we are to love our enemies and pray for them. Jesus said that we are to be peacemakers. Jesus promoted justice, and we are called to do the same. The list is long of the ways it's tough to follow Jesus. I add that it's tough to live the faith of any religious tradition, but I cite Jesus because I am a follower of Jesus, and I note that Central is part of the United Church of Christ. It can be a tough journey, but it can also be a joyous journey. I wouldn't trade it for the world.